The nation is still buzzing after what may go down as one of the most controversial late-night interviews in television history. Last night, Stephen Colbert's Late Show erupted into a fiery showdown between the host and his guest, sitting president, Donald J. Trump. The episode, which had been teased all week as a conversation that America needs to hear, quickly spiraled into a televised confrontation that no one could have anticipated, one packed with accusations, ideological warfare, and emotional vulnerability on a level rarely seen from either man. Tension began simmering only moments into the interview as Colbert, never shy about his disdain for Trump, opened with a forced smile and biting sarcasm. "Mr. President, great to have you here. I assume it wasn't easy escaping the Twitter war zone you've created out there." The audience laughed nervously. Trump gave a half-smile but didn't engage. Things escalated rapidly when Colbert leaned forward, his tone shifting from smug humor to pointed hostility. "Mr. President," he said, "you recently signed an executive order restricting gender-affirming care for trans youth and another banning trans women from participating in women's sports. A lot of Americans see that as not just cruel policy, but flat-out transphobic. I guess the question is, why are you so afraid of transgender people?" The room froze. Even the audience, largely made up of Colbert's usual cheering base, fell silent. Trump blinked slowly, then leaned back in his chair, visibly restraining himself. "Afraid?" he repeated, almost mockingly. "No, Stephen. What I'm afraid of is what's happening to the country." Colbert didn't flinch. "So, you're afraid of people being themselves? Afraid of kids getting health care they and their doctors believe they need?" "No," Trump shot back. "I'm afraid of grown adults pushing irreversible treatments on children who haven't even lived long enough to understand what they're being told to do to their bodies." Colbert cut in sharply. "But you're not a doctor, and neither are the Republican donors writing those policies. You're making it harder for people to exist as who they are." "I'm making it harder for kids to be exploited by ideology masquerading as medicine," Trump snapped. The exchange turned, combative as both men began talking over one another. Colbert pressed on with increasing intensity, accusing Trump of feeding red meat to a base that thrives on fear and prejudice, while Trump accused Colbert of performing for applause and mocking half the country every night from your millionaire perch. Every word added fuel to the fire. Then Colbert upped the ante. "You're targeting one of the most vulnerable groups in America and calling it protection. That's not leadership. That's cowardice." Trump's jaw tightened, but instead of responding immediately, he looked out into the crowd. His face, hard to read, equal parts anger and restraint. "You don't know what real leadership is," Trump finally said. "You sit in that chair night after night, pretending you're fighting for something, but all you're doing is selling outrage to people too tired to think critically." The audience, unsure whether to cheer or boo, mostly stayed silent. Colbert narrowed his eyes, sensing that he'd struck a nerve, but refusing to let up. "Tell me then," Colbert asked, "what exactly is so dangerous about someone using the pronouns that match who they are? Why do you keep calling it a woke mind virus? Why is that the enemy and not, say, your own policies?" Trump exhaled through his nose and leaned forward. His voice was lower now. "Because when you teach children that biology is offensive, when you tell them that truth is bigotry, and when you punish people for asking questions, that's not inclusion. That's indoctrination." Colbert tried to interrupt, but Trump raised his voice, not shouting, but demanding attention. "I've met parents, dozens of them, who are afraid to speak up because they'll be labeled hateful. Kids who are confused, pressured by social media and peer groups, and doctors who feel like they can't be honest without risking their careers. This isn't compassion, it's coercion." Colbert's posture stiffened. "So your solution is to ban them from sports and strip away health care?" Trump pointed a finger, not at Colbert, but at the crowd. "My solution is to pause, to ask what we're doing to a generation of kids caught in an ideological experiment with no long-term studies, no guardrails, and no public debate. The silence in the room deepened. Colbert's usual rhythm, snark, jab, applause, was off. He searched for a retort, but before he could speak again, Trump leaned in further and delivered the moment that lit up every screen in America last night. You call it woke, like it's some cute little trend, some social justice accessory. But I've sat in rooms with families wrecked by this. Parents who lost their kids to suicide, to depression, because the system told them to affirm, not to question, and when they did question, they were called monsters. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Just slightly. But the emotion was unmistakable. "I'm not here to win your approval, Stephen," Trump said. "I'm here because we can't keep pretending that compassion means shutting people up who see things differently." Colbert looked visibly caught off guard. "So you're saying compassion is silencing trans kids?" "I'm saying we've weaponized empathy into a tool of silence, and I won't be a part of that." A single tear slipped down Trump's cheek. He didn't wipe it, didn't flinch, just sat there, unmoving. The audience was completely silent. Colbert opened his mouth, but said nothing. And then the camera caught a flash of something no one expected. Emotion. Not from Trump's supporters online, not from right-wing media, from Colbert himself. For just a second, brief and unguarded, his face twisted into confusion. Maybe even doubt, but he recovered fast. "That's enough," Colbert said abruptly, his tone clipped. "We're done here." Trump didn't move. "Of course we are." But just as he prepared to rise from his chair, the camera cut to black. Seconds later, the show returned from its commercial break, not with its usual jazzy interlude or light-hearted quip from Stephen Colbert, but with a cold, charged silence. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay quiet. No band, no laughs, just the hum of tension. Donald Trump was still seated, his hands calmly folded on his lap. The tear that had traced down his cheek moments earlier had dried, but the expression on his face was unchanged. Stone, but deeply human. Colbert, on the other hand, had turned rigid. His fingers curled over his cue cards like he wasn't sure whether to read from them or rip them in half. "You want to talk about silence," Colbert said, his voice low and uncharacteristically serious. "You're the president. You have the biggest platform in the world. You've never been silenced a day in your life." Trump didn't hesitate. "And yet the moment someone like me raises a different view, we're labeled bigots. That's not a dialogue, that's an inquisition." Colbert gestured toward the audience, as if to remind Trump and himself that people were watching. "You're blaming the culture for a crisis you helped manufacture. You spent years mocking people, ridiculing marginalized groups, and now you want to stand here and cry victim because your actions have consequences?" "I'm not crying victim," Trump replied. "I'm pointing out a dangerous truth you refuse to confront. You dress this up in morality and call it progress. But progress isn't suppression, and it certainly isn't pretending children can consent to something that could scar them forever." The temperature in the room dropped again. "You keep saying children," Colbert said. "But you're not a parent to these kids. You don't know their lives. You don't know what they've faced. And yet you legislate over their identities like it's a policy game." Trump stared him down. "And you don't know what it's like to be a parent who's told to sit down, shut up, and watch your child disappear behind a wall of ideology. You're not allowed to question. These executive orders are about giving those parents a voice." Colbert stood up from behind his desk, as if rising gave his words more force. "You're giving cover to discrimination. You're fanning the flames of a moral panic and calling it bravery. If your tears are for anything, they're for a version of America that never really existed." Trump rose slowly in return, unshaken. "You don't get to define bravery, Stephen. You live in a studio with applause signs and a script. I live in a world where every word I say is dissected, twisted, and used to destroy not just me, but anyone who doesn't kneel to the narrative." The two men stood face to face now, just a few feet apart, the desk between them irrelevant. Trump's voice softened, almost imperceptibly, as he continued. "I didn't come here to fight. I came here because people are scared. Not of pronouns, not of identity, but of what happens when truth becomes taboo, when debate becomes hate speech, when parents are accused of abuse for asking questions. You think I'm the problem? Fine. Blame me, but don't pretend the fire wasn't already burning." Colbert was silent. Trump stepped around the desk, his eyes scanning the audience, not as a showman but as if genuinely searching for someone who might understand him. "I met a father last week who broke down in front of me. His daughter started hormone therapy at 13 after 2 counseling sessions. 2. Now she's 17, detransitioned, and suicidal. He told me he wakes up every morning wondering if he made a mistake by trusting the experts. But when he asked questions, they called him transphobic. They pushed him out of the room." Colbert swallowed hard. For once, no monologue came to his rescue. No clever punchline, no audience laughter. Just stillness. Trump's voice cracked again. "This isn't about hate. It's about caution. About knowing we're on a path where questioning the narrative is a crime, and that's terrifying. For everyone. Left, right, trans, cis, everyone." The crowd was no longer reacting. Not out of disrespect, but because they didn't know how. The energy had changed. They weren't watching a political brawl anymore. They were watching something raw, uncomfortable, human. Colbert's lips tightened. His gaze dropped to his desk. He looked like a man caught in his own theater, unable to find the exit. Finally he spoke. "We're out of time." It wasn't a line. It wasn't delivery. It was escape. Trump gave the faintest nod. "Of course we are." He turned to leave, walking past the cameras, past the band who hadn't played a note since the break, past the stunned silence of an audience used to watching their host eviscerate every guest who sat in that chair. But this time, the script hadn't played out the way it usually did. Colbert stood still. No, thank you for coming. No handshake. Just the cold distance of two men who had collided at the fault line of a nation's cultural divide. As Trump reached the curtain at the back of the stage, a producer hurried toward him, headset tilted, unsure whether to usher him out or ask for a final quote. Trump waved him off gently and walked out without a word. Back at the desk, Colbert finally sat. He stared at the camera, blinking once, twice, as if deciding whether to address the audience or move on. But there was no easy pivot, no closing gag. The energy was too heavy, too real. "We'll be right back," he mumbled, but they wouldn't. Not really. Not in the way they had been before. The screen faded to the show's logo. The audience clapped, soft, scattered, unsure. The credits rolled in awkward silence. And just like that, it was over. By morning, the internet had exploded. Clips of Trump's tearful monologue were trending under hashtags like "Late Show Meltdown," on "Trump Unscripted," and "Colbert Confronted." The usual battle lines were drawn in the digital sand, some praising Trump's unexpected vulnerability, others slamming Colbert for folding under pressure, and many arguing over who had won the exchange. But to anyone who watched it live, it didn't feel like anyone had won. It felt like two versions of America had collided under the lights of a studio stage, exposing a rift too deep for any punchline to cover. And in the middle of it all, one man walked off in silence, and another sat quietly with nothing left to say.